All right, my friends, chapter 11, and the theme of chapter 11, the theme is progress. Last chapter's theme was individual achievement. What you see in progress is you start to see things taking shape, one, because of the Industrial Revolution. You got a lot of industry that's growing, not only the size of the pockets of the owners, but you're also seeing a change in the way we do things and also what we have for those things. That, of course, leads us to devise new tools and new ideas about how to manage those tools, and then we call that technologies. And you put it all together, and you're going to have this growth of capitalism that is pretty unheard of, and we're starting to copy on the English and the European model of it, and that's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. One of the first key areas that you started to see improvement was in agriculture. Agriculture is tremendously difficult without modern day technologies. For instance, the concept of fertilizer, modern day fertilizer, is unheard of. So we're talking about human and animal fertilizer, which is hard to get a hold of quantities enough to make your crop yields go up. That's just the reality of that. Second problem, of course, is you're dealing with horsepower, horse or ox power. And horsepower is not the best. It's better than human power. So the Europeans bring those horses over, those oxes over, those cattle over, and it starts to change the way we do things. So a few ideas about why in this time period. We're pretty much talking between the 1820s and 1860. What you start to see opening up are the Eastern Great Plains, and the Eastern Great Plains, being that they are a flat, huge area of space, they needed to be exploited a little bit more efficiently. You got John Deere, who's going to develop his steel tip plow, and then eventually he's going to create the internal combustion engine tractor. But the steel tip plow is very important because a lot of the ground has never been plowed before, it's never been turned over, and the steel tip allows you to go deeper. In fact, this is the key thing about growing crops, is that you got to go deep to get that topsoil turned over, and the topsoil is the most nutritious part of the ground. And if you keep scratching the surface, which is what scratch plows used to do, you never really get the nutritional value of the soil into your plants, which means your crop yields are low. Kind of the natural consequence of that. On a secondary note, manpower is often required for a lot of this agriculture, and manpower is just really inefficient. So Cyrus McCormick is going to devise his mechanical reaper, and this reaper is horse-driven or ox-driven, and the idea behind it is that those tools can do the job of hundreds of men in less time and less efficiency. And I think the key formula to remember is, if you can lower time, if you can lower your costs, you're going to increase your profit. And that's the magic formula of the Industrial Revolution for almost anybody. And time in manufacture, time in production is just simply starting to turn huge dividends, as they mentioned in the opening section with Eli Whitney devising his, not Eli Whitney, sorry, who am I thinking about? I'm thinking about Isaac Singer's sewing machine. Isaac Singer's sewing machine, Eli Whitney's cotton gin, Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts, Eli Whitney's first rifles that were kind of created with irreplaceable parts, lead us all the way up to Colt's Peacemaker, which of course was the six-shooter, the Colt 45 as they called it. Positive, negative impacts, but yeah, huge in terms of the way those develop and the way they come about and how that looks. I don't think we really had a gun culture. I don't think we had a gun culture until you had mass production. And gun culture, simply put, was nobody could really have the tools that would allow guns to be, mass produced. So if you had weapons, they were used as tools to hunt and also to protect yourself. But nobody really carried around guns. But Colt was going to change that, transform that. The Colt 45, the Peacemaker as they called it, was the mass-produced weapon that's going to allow him to become super rich, but also he's going to take Eli Whitney's concept, adapt it to the American system, and begin a huge transformation of power, I suppose, on an individual level. And where this is mostly, allowed to prosper is in the Wild Wild West. And the reason they call it the Wild Wild West is that there are few people, and few people means there's few law enforcement officials to watch those people. And that's the transformation, I think, that is really interesting and powerful in that kind of a way, and the way it sets itself up. The key about our American system, as you notice, is the interchangeable parts. The American system, the whole idea is that you can transform the whole thing and keep it running. If a part breaks down, you can pull it out. And interchangeable parts are the new way of looking at machines, because machines can't just run for a couple of years and then completely be thrown away, especially large functioning machines like reapers. You can't just throw those away, because the point is that you've just wasted a tremendous amount of labor and materials in keeping those things going. So when you start to see the transformation of those interchangeable parts, that's a key development that falls along those lines. Morse and his code are going to change information. We're starting to see information become quicker in terms of its transfer, but also more importantly, it's starting to have a huge impact on decision making across the planet, impact on a political and also on a social level, because now you can get information almost instantaneously. That was kind of created, Morse code and the Morse system of traveling through wires that were strung from poles. That was designed to allow railroads to have efficient communication between stops, but also allowed the communication to bypass human routes. So railroads and Morse code routes often followed the same pathways. And railroads really are rivers on rails. And the idea is you can move things cheaply by water. The problem by land is, of course, the obstacles of the land, but also the weight of the goods, and we don't really have the technology yet. So what this allows us to do is create internal networks of transportation that look like rivers. And these internal networks are also going to move our population. Our population kind of avoids the center of the country, and the population, of course, is going to start to spread around a bit more evenly, but not quite yet, because it's mostly centered in those eastern cities, as you noticed in that concept. Train travel was miserable, very poor in terms of ventilation. You're basically venting all this coal dust right back on the population behind you. Not comfortable seating, a lot of dangerous things happening, cinders, fires, delays. All this was possible, and in some cases the gauge of the track was different. So you could go a certain number of miles and have to completely change tracks and trains because they weren't uniform. So once we got that idea that we should keep everything uniform, we should keep everything going, that's the only way that you start to see railroads change. And a famous railroad town, probably the most famous of them all, are the towns that link together several networks. And one of the most famous railroad towns is Chicago. Chicago is a nothing city on Lake Michigan, but the reason it became a hub was because of the railroads that allowed it to connect to the east and the west and the south. Railroads. And it became a railroad town, and eventually it became a manufacturing town where a lot of products are going to be constructed for human production and consumption, and that's kind of the idea behind it. Early railroad construction was mostly private. So you had a lot of private investors that were saying, this is going to make us rich because we can charge rates just like you can charge on a ferry or on a canal. The private load often stretched out investors, and sometimes it was really risky. So what they were really hoping for and what they were really looking for was some kind of government subsidy or some kind of government support. But that would not come until after the Civil War. The government support in the early phases was lacking. I suppose it was just simply we didn't have the cash for it, but we were also focused on other priorities. And the priorities were not really, about linking the country by rail. They're really about dealing with the issues of expanding the territory and dealing with the slave versus free state question. One of the things that starts to happen, though, one of the miracles that starts to happen, is you start to see this mobility possibility. And I'm not saying it's a guarantee, but the mobility in terms of income and class is starting to become possible. My voice cracks on purpose for emphasis. The idea, I suppose, is that we have opportunities here that we don't have in other places. and that's going to start to change the way we think about what's going on. And one of the things that a lot of people are drawn to is the concept of creating things out of nothing. But there's a tremendous amount of risk involved in that, because just because you have the great idea doesn't mean it's going to work. So one of the problems is that the mobility of income was possible, but what was more than likely was, if you live in an urban area, the cost of living often outstripped the wages of a single breadwinner. So everybody worked on a farm. That was kind of a no-brainer decision, because you had to have everybody's labor. But in the city, you're getting paid, and only a certain amount of wage could be collected by each worker. So what you had, more than likely, was you had families working, including children. And these families were trying to survive in an environment where they couldn't make their own materials, and they couldn't make their own necessities kind of show up. That is going to be important, because in a lot of ways the farmer is worse off than the wage earner, but at least they can create a lot of their necessities by, farm goods and farm animals. So that's kind of the benefit of that. And as a result of that, I think what you start to see is the way we change our standard of living. And our standard of living is how we're living, more importantly, more than what we're doing. But in the 1840s and 50s, we started to pay attention to issues such as health, welfare issues. I'm not talking about welfare, I'm talking about like how people are being taken care of, and also how society as a whole is functioning. And these reform movements, a lot of reform movements were talking about that early on, and it eventually got the attention of people. One of the things that you have with machines is machines often drive down the cost of an item. So what used to be impossible to obtain now is possible. So we are becoming consumers more than anything else, because the items are cheap enough that we can replace them, we can get new ones, but more importantly, we can get our first things. We can get our first chairs, we can get our first couches, we can get our first lamps. And as they start to show up, we start to embrace this new concept that we can improve ourselves in the way things work. The problem with living in cities, though, is if you don't have the money, it's hard to fit all these people in. So they began to devise something that was called row houses. And row houses are what they are. They call them also brownstones, because that's the color of the stone that they often use to kind of construct the outside facade. But a row house was simply a rectangular building stacked right next to each other. The downside is that the only ventilation and light comes from the front and the back end of the building, and you don't have this ability to have the middle of the building lit up and, of course, ventilated. So it's a problem if you're cooking something. It's also a problem if you want to have access to light, natural light, for whatever reason that's the case. These often were overcrowded, and the reason was because there just wasn't the construction able to keep up with the demand. So they became known as tenements. And this is mostly where the poor lived, in the industrial areas. And later on, when we have major immigration, they're going to be overfilled with a lot of individuals who are just simply going to have no other place to go. If you could get beyond these residences, you might be able to have what looks like modern-day townhouses or apartments. One of the things that you tried to kind of like construct was you tried to construct that idea about what they were talking about when they talked about genteel society, where you're starting to craft the things. So you're looking for things like Rococo furniture, items that were rare and handmade, perhaps, that were not available because of mass production, and art, libraries, books, literature, clothes. All of a sudden now you started to see the symbols of genteel society creeping into what we call today the middle class. And if people had the idea that they wished to keep that genteel society going, then you started to see this concept of urban planning that was, new at the time period. And these urban planners were mostly working on things like parks. In fact, Central Park was designed to give people a break from all of the urban blight that was there before. we have mass changes because of modern technology. So a lot of the folks are dealing with that on the cities. On the frontier, the common frontier house is the log cabin, because that's all the materials you have out there. And most of the log cabin is either a dirt floor or a plank floor. But if you get further out in the Great Plains, you have what Laura Ingalls Wilder had to deal with, which is a sod house, or a sod roof house, which is like when they cut the actual sod off of the ground where the grass grows, and you make it as part of your roof. It insulates you, keeps the water out for the most part, but it's kind of miserable to live under dirt all the time because it's not very comfortable. Dirt dries out, it becomes dusty, it becomes, inconvenient. If you think about simple stuff, like how are we cooking all of our food? Well, we're devising new technologies. We used to cook over open flames for the most part, but now we have stoves, and these stoves are mass-produced using iron, and then later they'll be mass-produced using steel. Most of them are wood-burning, but we're starting to see a new fuel supply show up, and the new fuel supply of the Industrial Revolution, of course, is coal, which is a dirty polluter. But then again, if you're burning something, what's not? So one of the realities was that you started to deal with pollution a lot, and pollution was kind of a common side effect of the Industrial Revolution. There just simply was no regulation on what people put into the air or the water, and the air and the water were the most common areas for it to show up. So that's kind of the downside for that. There is not much in the area of public works that we see today. There's not much in the areas of sanitation, where you're talking about picking up trash. There is not much in the areas of wastewater management. There's not much in the area of sewage, and there's simply not much in the area of running water. So a lot of people are relying on public pumps, wells, and these can often become polluted because we're oversaturating the land with all of the human waste that we're pushing out every day. Cities were filled with animals. Cities were filled with humans. They smelled bad. We didn't have flush toilets. We didn't have indoor plumbing. So a lot of this city life was really a hard way. And many people could not stand it during the months where it got hot and smelly, so they got the heck out and they moved on in terms of where they were. Somebody who kind of epitomized this new idea about middle class ideas and life is Catherine Beecher. Catherine Beecher is going to push this genteel society concept out there by writing a widely popular treatise called on Domestic Economy, published 1841. But Catherine Beecher is really promoting this idea of self-improvement, of self-knowledge, of internal education, and she's trying to push women into a power position in the house, because obviously the power is in the home. So they began to assert themselves over controlling who had what and how that worked, and all the things that the men were not supposed to deal with. One of the side effects of all the sanitation problematic things is disease. We have no germ theory. We have no way of tracking outbreaks. So we had two different ways of thinking about it. One was the contagion theory. The contagion theory was things just happen. There's no real rhyme or reason. People just start getting sick. And the other one was the miasm or the miasma theory, which is about air. It's in the air. Something's bad in the air. And of course, if you smelled these cities, you obviously could relate to that. The idea about treatment of diseases was not very useful. The heck did I just do? Was not very useful. So their only effective way of doing something was to quarantine and let it burn itself out. And you saw outbreaks of yellow fever and cholera. Sometimes you had plague show up again. So it was kind of hard to kind of deal with such issues like that. In the 1840s, there was an Englishman who used to joke around with this chemical called nitrous oxide, and they used it at parties, just like this, intoxicant. And people would laugh, and they call it the laughing gas. But this is going to help us handle major surgeries. Nitrous oxide, also known as laughing gas, this is going to help us provide the ability to do effective surgeries, because your body really needs to be out. It can't handle the strain and the stress of being cut into and being torn apart. And then another area that helped a little bit, of course, was the use of ether, which was a temporary knockout drug. And you've seen the old movies where they make people take swigs of alcohol, but that wasn't really effective to handle the pain. One of the problems, though, is that surgeons don't really have the concept of cleanliness. So without germ theory knowledge, they're not washing their hands between patients. And the primary way you die is probably secondary infections. These infections are preventable, but they don't know where they're coming from. They just know that you got sick again and you died. So unfortunately, it's a bad deal if you get hit with a doctor's visit in this time period. So speaking of doctors, there's a whole bunch of ideas about how to fix people. And they sometimes were quacky and wacky, and people didn't really see them as being effective. Whoa, where's my pen? Where is my pen? Can't find it. There it is. There it is. Let me go down. The idea, of course, was to try to keep people preventable, I suppose, in terms of treatment, try to prevent the treatments. But you had things like hydropathy or hydropathy. Hydropathy was known as the water cure, and the water cure was, a design where the idea was to put yourself in cold baths and wet packs and bathe yourself in water, allow yourself to cleanse yourself, to renovate yourself, to rejuvenate yourself, to drink pure water, to drink fresh water. And in a lot of ways, what you're doing is you're cleaning yourself, so you might be, healthier than you were before. And then, of course, a lot of people are dehydrated because of a lot of factors. They just didn't understand about hydration and how that worked. So the water treatment, the water therapy, if you will, maybe was effective for a lot of folks, and they started to buy into the concept. And sanitariums or places where you would go to rest would pop up in places where the water would be either unique because it had hot springs or because it was simply in abundance, and people would go there to kind of survive that. Another one, Sylvester Graham of the Graham cracker. Graham's cracker was designed to be an alcoholic treatment. Later, he realized that you could maybe use it for other things as well. If you're trying to avoid alcohol, maybe you could avoid other things as well. So if you wanted to treat yourself, for things like sexual excess or untamed, desires like I want to gamble or something else, he looked at his graham cracker as a solution for this. And it was designed to push people towards more healthy living, I suppose, because alcohol is not that healthy of a substance to put in your body in mass quantities. And there's this concept that, hey, you can fix yourself if you work yourself in this way. And remember the Brook Farm community, his connection to that was kind of strong, trying to get rid of unnatural cravings of the people, like sex and for other things like that. And those things popped up as well. And he became kind of like a guru of health, and people would listen to him about trying to avoid things. And I suppose he made sense because you avoid the bad and seek the good. And vegetarianism is popping into people's belief structures here also. So that's also kind of unique and interesting. One of the stranger ones that I think comes from a couple of different things is phrenology. And phrenology is the study of bumps on the head and bumps on the head. And what's so interesting about it is that they were looking at the body and the mind as being affected by things that were external on the skull. So it's not like bumps on your head with the skin, it's like bumps on your skull, because every skull is looking different. Every skull is unique in terms of what it is. But the Fowler brothers, Orson and Lorenzo, pioneered this idea, and they were pushing it out there, trying to teach people how to exercise your mental facilities and trying to create, your own fix to your own problems. So if you know what's wrong with you, you can perhaps fix it and avoid things that might, hurt you, like, coffee, tea, meat, spices, sex, alcohol, things like Graham was talking about as well. Well, interesting enough, I think this ironically links us up to a racial theory that will come back again and again, but it's eugenics. That because of physical traits, you can make an assumption about a person's abilities. And I think that is crucial to understanding the mindset of these folks, because they're looking at themselves saying, this person's successful. What makes them successful? Without being able to pin it down, they're looking at physical traits. And of course, a lot of physical traits are, you had to be probably one of the first people in the country, which means you're probably Northern European, you're probably a man, and you're probably having certain things happening in your life that look very similar to other people's lives, but you also look the same as the other people. And then they're starting to divide society based on those principles, which I think is flawed. But then again, they had nothing else to measure it by. They had nothing else to look at it. And those are like the way of fixing and seeing how people work. But you're also seeing, because of the Morse code and because of mass media starting to kind of create itself, you're also seeing an entertainment growth here. And, you know, P.T. Barnum is a classic example of a person, rags to riches, who takes an idea about how to entertain people, Barnum, there you go, how to entertain people, and puts it on a level which is kind of like spectacle. And his circus is his lasting gift to us. But he also created the American Museum. And the American Museum was kind of a museum of the strange. And people want and like the strange. And my own psychological philosophy is that we like what's strange because it makes us feel more normal. Or we like what's dangerous because we feel more safe because it's not happening to us. So he was playing on perhaps these early psychologies, and he was using it to make himself super rich. But the idea is that his push was to make his product sell, and entertainment allows you to do that, which is kind of interesting. You're seeing a rise of newspapers because of the Morse code too. Look at how many things are connected back to that. The penny press of the day, newspapers are starting to give information twice, 3 times a day. And the way newspapers make their money is in advertising. And what are they selling? They're selling all of the new products of the Industrial Revolution, which of course is going to drive up the consumption of what people are buying. So the penny press is creating a mindset of like, we need to be informed, we must be informed. And it's kind of like checking your Facebook or checking your website news today. You're looking for this change, and you're always shocked when it happens. Like, oh my gosh, this happened today. And I think in a lot of ways that's how the newspapers of the penny press operated. They were trying to give people as quick of an informational burst as possible. Sometimes the stories were really good, sometimes they were made up, but then again, the idea is that you're trying to keep the public informed, and that was the thought behind that. Theater is our television in this time period. And theater is kind of a real interesting combination of factors, because you're bringing all of the classes together under one roof. It's where the classes mingle, because it's your one place to get entertained as a group, perhaps, in that way. As I mentioned in class, in 1849, the famous Astor Place riot. The Astor Place riot was a fight that took place between fans of William McReady, who was the British actor, and Edwin Forrest, the American actor. And 22 people were killed. 22 died because they were arguing and fighting and killing each other over which did the better job producing a character for a play. I mean, this is the time where the audience took a role. They stamped their feet, they whistled, they hooted, they threw vegetables, potatoes, tomatoes at the bad actors they didn't like. It was very much connected to emotion of the audience. And they played on that, and they made that work. And a lot of the people who supported the American, of course, were working class, and the people who supported the British actor were the aristocratic crowd. And the plays themselves were kind of like melodramatic. They were not very good. They were very simplified. And melodramas are something that you might kind of like look at on television today, where it's like the 30-minute sitcom or the 60-minute drama. And the melodrama is designed to give you quick entertainment without too much work in terms of what it was. But, however, Shakespeare was being performed, and Shakespeare was very much in demand in the United States. They were looking for all kinds of ideas. And now, finally, female actresses are playing Shakespearean roles as opposed to male actors. And that's kind of a nice change of pace, especially if you want to be a female actor. You actually have a shot at it now. The problem with the minstrel shows, as I mentioned, is that they're going to perpetuate a racial stereotype, which is really unfortunate. This racial stereotype, remember, is designed to sell people a product. And the product, of course, is entertainment. But here's the problem. You have white actors in blackface. White actors, they're in blackface. And to communicate to a crowd that is probably mostly white, they are going to overemphasize the stereotype. They're going to overemphasize the accent. They're going to overemphasize the perceived lack of education. They're going to overemphasize the singing and the dancing. And what's going to unfortunately be the result is that white people will not understand African Americans. One, they're isolated in the South for the most part, and two, they're not coming into contact with them yet. So who are they coming into contact with? You're coming into contact with Zip Coon, Uncle Ned. You're coming in contact with Dan Bryant. And these individuals are destroying a identity that up till this point has not really been dealt with or talked about and made possible in terms of what it was, in terms of what that is. On the next phase of operations, now we talk about the arts, and the key thing about the arts is that we start to have an American art form for the first time. We are starting to diverge from the English and from the Europeans. But the Hudson River School is a classic example of romantic art. Romanticism was pretty prevalent in the early 1800s. But the Hudson River School were huge landscapes, and I'm talking huge landscapes that really emphasized the scope and scale of American identity. And that was pretty popular at the time period, to have huge landscapes created and constructed. In terms of writing, a lot of our authors in the early phases are talking about American history and American historical events. So, you have Hawthorne, whose famous story, Last of the Mohicans, is about the 7 Years' War, and The Last of the Mohicans is an adventure novel, which is really, if you've ever seen the movie or read the book, it's a really great adventure. But you also have people who are talking about other things and other items that are kind of popping up as well. You've got Herman Melville talking about the culture of the coast. And of course, his famous is about the whale Moby Dick, which is one of the great all-time American classics. You also have Hawthorne. No, Hawthorne did not write that. Sorry about that. My bad. I thought we said Fenimore Cooper. Cooper, my friends. James Fenimore Cooper wrote Last of the Mohicans. And Hawthorne and the famous stories of Washington Irving, including the one that comes up in Halloween a lot, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and others are writing about American stories which are unique to us in terms of our identity, in terms of what we're going on through and going with, in terms of history and what's happening with that. Edgar Allan Poe, of course, is the great mystery/horror novelist who dies a horribly young death because of tuberculosis. Mystery/horror. And all these are kind of creating this new identity of what's going on and what's happening. One of the great beneficiaries of that is going to be Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher, remember, she's one of the Beecher girls. Harriet Beecher Stowe is going to write the most inflammatory book of the 1840s, which is called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And the irony about her writing Uncle Tom's Cabin was it was complete fiction in more than one way, because she never even saw a slave for her entire young life. Cabin, not cabine. And that was a huge change in the terms of the attitude of the people and what they were looking at with slavery and with the people who are also slave holders and what they do. Emerson and Thoreau are your philosophers of sorts. They're really talking about this new concept of transcendentalism. Transcendentalism, the idea that we can transcend things through our own work and hard decisions and makers of our decisions, transcendentalism. But also that emotion plays a huge role in shaping our world. So they're focused on the human as as we relate to our environment. So Walden's classic example of him living on a lake for a year and just kind of like giving up on the modern life, and others are dealing with this concept as well, that we have control over our spirit, and each person needs to discover this truth on their own. We can discover this truth by our own work, and that brings in people like Margaret Fuller, who's writing about how women have that ability to do that in terms of changing their ways of thinking in others. Which leads us to the most famous poet of the 1800s, who's Walt Whitman. And Walt Whitman is a unique character in many ways, but he's the poet who's going to try to capture the identity of what it is to be American. And his most famous poems are going to be published right before the Civil War, and they are entitled Leaves of Grass. And these poems give us a shape or a look into the mind of people in terms of how they work and how they operate at that time in history. And it's almost like looking at psychology as well as they devise it and they create this. However, a lot of individuals are doing it just for the love of the game. So the Lyceum movement is a unique way of looking at that. Lyceums are lectures where people would travel and give lectures to the public. And Lyceums were often held in people's homes or halls in towns. And these lecture circuits were a way of getting information quickly from the person who's writing about it. But they were also designed to give the person who wrote things a profit, because it was hard selling books back in the day when people couldn't afford to buy them in the first place. But one of the new things that's going to happen is this new technology is going to create a market for information, and the public just wants this information. They want to go to the theaters. They want to see it. They want to hear about it. So the new technology, of course, the new print technology, are going to create, the dime novel, which is going to be a way of selling a mass-produced product. But also, you're writing for profit now. So a lot of the stories are not really stories. They're supposed to be sold, which is kind of the unique way of looking at it in terms of how that works and how that develops. So the key word for the time period, as you start to see it growing over time, is progress. And if you can find the progress in these small events, then the goal is to figure out how does that lead to certain changes in who we are. What is the changes going to be? And if you can do that, you're set to go. So that ends chapter 11. Hope you have a nice day. Talk to you soon.